so unexplainable. I can hardly think as you call me, deeper still as you call me, deeper still as you call me, deeper still into love, love. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am, it's who I am, it's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you are, and I am loved by you. It's who I am, it's who I am, it's who I am.
Good morning, friends. Welcome to The Well. My name is Ryan Gear. I'm the pastor here. If you're new with us, you're our guest, and we're glad you're here. And if you'd like to let us know, just text the word WELCOME to 480-530-7234. It'll text you back with a digital connect card. Just fill that out, tell us about yourself, and you'll get more information about The Well. Thanks for being with us this morning. Today is the last week of our series, Not That Kind of Christian. And every week we want to be known by what we're for, not by what we're against. We want to take the positive approach, and at the same time, when we say not that kind of Christian, we all know who we're talking about, don't we? There are self-professing Christians in America here in 2022 who are very loud about their views, and some of them may view themselves as the moral police of society. They look down their noses at other people in condemnation. Some feel some kind of a loss of power. They feel threatened, and so they're willing to join with politically authoritarian movements to try to force the rest of the country to live according to their religion. And there's even a tie sociologists have found with white supremacy. And so we have this movement of white Christian nationalism. We have some self-professing Christians who seem to be anti-science during a time of the pandemic and climate change, or anti-intellectual. And there are some who seem to be even against women's rights. And as we're talking about today, the rights of people who are in the LGBTQ community. And so in this series, what we're doing is we're reading about the Jesus of the Gospels. And we're discovering that the Jesus we read about in the Bible seems to be a lot different than that kind of Christianity that we're seeing so much today. And we just want to proclaim in this series who the real Jesus is. As we think about difficult theological questions and social issues, we want to get to know the real Jesus and be the kind of Christian who follows the real Jesus in the Bible. And today, we're ending this series with what has been one of the most controversial issues in America. And of course, religion has factored in a great deal in the debate and in the arguments about this issue. And it's the issue of the Bible and human sexuality. And so today, first of all, I want to thank you for joining us and watching this, and acknowledge that this is an emotional topic. It's so difficult because it affects people's view of the Bible and their deeply held religious convictions. And at the same time, there are those of us like myself who have a deep love for people in my life who are in the LGBTQ community, friends of mine, family, people in my church, people whom I dearly love. And so, of course, this is an emotional topic for anybody to hear. And what we want to do is be able to love God with our minds and our hearts and love our neighbors as ourselves. That's what Jesus calls us to do. And so as we look at these Bible verses today and we talk about the stories of people, I invite you to acknowledge any emotion that you feel. Some of these verses are very difficult to deal with, even for a person like myself who is an affirming pastor. There are verses that I want to deal with today that are difficult to read because they just don't fit our understanding of the LGBTQ community. But what I want to do today is share two things out of my own life. I was raised in a strict conservative Christian environment. I had what would be the traditional view on same-sex relationships for the first part of my life. And I, over a period of several years, changed my mind. And I want to share today why I changed my mind. And it had to do primarily with two things. First of all, I realized that interpreting the Bible involves a lot more gray than it does black and white. And the second thing is I met and got to know and came to love people who were a part of the LGBTQ community. Those two things are what helped me to change my mind over the years. And so that's where we're headed today. I want to look at the Bible and what it means to interpret the Bible and these scriptures, and then share some stories about people in my life who have been influential and helped me see the Bible and sexuality differently, and how I came to love folks in my life who are in the LGBTQ community. So we run ads about the well on social media, including Facebook and Instagram. And when you run ads on Facebook, anybody who sees them can comment underneath the ads. Have you realized it's probably best not to read the comments? Whenever you see something on Facebook, it's probably best just to skip over the comments. Some of the comments on our ads that anybody can see and anybody can read are pretty nasty. I used to try to delete the nastiest ones that I can find. I still do if they're really over the line, but I just couldn't keep up, and so some of them are just difficult to read. Those that are in disagreement of our stance as a church, but they're not necessarily nasty, will almost always say something like this: the Bible is clear on this issue. This church doesn't believe the Bible. Almost all of the time. And so what I wanted to do today was talk about what it means to interpret the Bible, specifically on the issue of sexuality. Deal with a few verses that folks often cite to condemn those who are in same-sex relationships. And so first of all, there are well-meaning Christians who love the Bible and they love God and they do their best to love people. And they believe that if a church welcomes the LGBTQ community into full participation, that we are undermining the authority of the Bible, that we don't believe the Bible, that we're diminishing the Bible, we don't care about the Bible doesn't mean anything to us. It just seems to be the only conclusion they can come to, because to them this issue is so black and white. It's so easy to interpret the Bible on the issue of sexuality, and for them there's no mental category to allow them to see it any other way. They see it an ad about this church called The Well in Chandler, Arizona, and online, and there's just no hook to hang that on for them. And so they view the issue of sexuality as an attack on the authority of the Bible, as a threat to their faith, a threat to the authority of the Bible. So where I want to start this morning is that the greatest challenge to the authority of the Bible in American history was not sexuality. I don't even believe it was science in the evolution versus creation debate. In my view, the greatest challenge to the authority of the Bible in American history was slavery. Now, my guess is you think slavery's wrong, and we're in agreement on that. But slavery was one of the many issues in which the way Americans interpreted the Bible changed over time. Now, others were science and religious violence and cultural colonialism and alcohol and women's rights and more recently rock music. But slavery, in my view, was the greatest challenge to the authority of the Bible in American history. At one time, slavery was the most controversial topic a pastor could address. Can you believe that? But we know that from history. We know that from reading sermons in the 1800s surrounding the Civil War. And I'll just quickly say that slavery divided our country, and between 600,000 and 750,000 Americans killed each other over slavery. The reason that slavery was the greatest challenge to the authority of the Bible in American history is that the Bible is ambiguous at best on the topic of slavery. The Bible mentions slavery 200 times and mentions servants hundreds more. Not once does the Bible condemn slavery or call slavery a sin, or that slavery should be made illegal. 1 Timothy 1:10 does condemn slave traders, so that's important to mention, but out of the hundreds of mentions, the Bible does not call slavery a sin or say that slavery should be abolished. There are verses that say slaves are equal to free persons. And those are inspiring verses if you're a Christian in 2022. But then the New Testament contains verses like this from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 and 9. Paul writes, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ, not only while you're being watched in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Render service with enthusiasm as to the Lord and not to men and women, knowing that whatever good you do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are slaves or free. And masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both of you have the same master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality." And this is actually one of several passages in the New Testament that are referred to by scholars as Grecoroman household codes. They actually address the way that husbands and wives interact and the way children and their parents interact. And I asked a guy one time what he thought these passages meant, and he said, "Oh, it means I should do a good job for my boss at work." And I said, "Well, are you paid for your job? Does your job pay you?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, then you're not a slave. This verse is not about being nice to your boss or doing a good job for your company in 21st century America. This passage is about slavery. It's about people who are being enslaved, held against their will, and made to do work against their will. And yes, Paul here says, slaves, obey your masters, and also masters, be kind to your slaves, and that you're both equal in a sense, and we like that part. But for those of us who are thinking compassionate Christians, we have a very difficult time with this idea of slaves obey your masters as though you're obeying Christ. So it's not just about the past. We still have slavery in this world. We still have slavery in America. It's illegal, but we still have it. We have slavery here in Arizona. There's human smuggling and sex trafficking. And so if you were at a gas station and someone ran up to you and they looked terrified and they said, "Please help me. I'm being held against my will. I'm being enslaved by somebody. Please help me. Please call the police. Please help me. I just escaped. Please help me." Would you look at that person and say to them, "Oh, I would love to help you. I'm sorry, but Ephesians 6:5 says, 'Slaves, obey your masters.'" Would you quote Ephesians 6:5 to that person? I don't think you would. If you did, in many states, you would be imprisoned for being an accomplice in hostage taking. So if we were to literally apply Ephesians 6:5 in 21st century America, we would go to prison if we told a slave that. So maybe interpreting the Bible is not as black and white and not as simple as what so many of us were taught to believe. And for those of us who have this view of the Bible that it was just dropped out of heaven, and God said, "Here's my book, just read it and do whatever it says. This verse in particular says that's not a very good idea. Since Abraham Lincoln, interpreting this verse literally and quoting it to somebody who's a slave is not a very good idea. But this verse and others like it were quoted every Sunday in pulpits across the southern United States in the 1800s to defend the practice of slavery. Now, does what I just said diminish the Bible? Does it mean that we don't love the Bible, or the well doesn't believe the Bible, or the well doesn't care about the Bible? Does it mean that? I don't think it does. I think what it means is that we recognize that Paul lived 2,000 years ago. He never dreamed that slavery could be illegal in the Roman Empire. It would be another 1,800 years before nations of the world began outlawing slavery. He was a man of his time. And the assumptions about the world and the practices of the time and the Grecoroman household codes and the views about society and social issues and how society should be ordered, those find their way into the Bible. That's why context, historical context, is so important when we interpret the Bible. Slavery, like science and women's rights, the discipline of children, revealed that the Bible must be interpreted in the light of its historical context. Thinking Christians who want to take the Bible seriously as a guide for our lives somehow struggle with these passages, and what is obvious to some is not so obvious to others. The books of the Bible were not written in 21st century America. They were written in a much different time on the other side of the planet 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And the social views of the time do find their way into the Bible. So if we took the social views that we find in the Bible and we tried to apply them today, women would wear head coverings in worship services. Paul writes more in 1 Corinthians 11 about women wearing head coverings in worship services than anything about sexuality. We would stone disobedient children. How many of you are glad we don't apply that one literally? Or we would beat children with rods. We would abstain from shellfish because the Bible says that. We would assume that slavery would always be a part of the world. And we would stone people who were gay. So well-meaning Christians who insist the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. Well, they would have a hard time applying that to every verse they read in the Bible, and some would find themselves in prison. As a matter of fact, there are some friends of mine who call that selective inerrancy, that there are people who say the Bible is inerrant, and so I just read it and I just do what it says. And what's really going on is they're being selective in the verses that they think are inerrant. Because if they thought it's all inerrant and it's all God's eternal all-time will for humanity, then they would find themselves in trouble, like quoting Ephesians 6:5. So our question when we interpret any passage in the Bible is this: do these passages reveal God's eternal will for humanity, or do they reflect the social views of the time? That's a question we need to ask whenever we read anything in the Bible. Now, the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says all of the Bible is culturally conditioned. So the truth is, all of the Bible contains the views of the time. These are authors writing in their own languages, their own vocabularies, with their own views of the world in different places, mostly in the Middle East, but at different times in history, in different contexts, and different views of the world, what we would call science, but they didn't think of it as science in that sense, and different views of women and different views of God even, depending on what book in the Bible you're reading. Who is God? What is God like? What does salvation mean? You get different answers depending on what book of the Bible you're reading. I said in a series, or in a sermon several weeks ago, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament starts in Hebrew, switches to Aramaic, and then goes back to Hebrew. And so if God was just dictating to the author what to write, God changed languages midstream as the author was writing the book. And there are authors who have different vocabularies. The Gospel of Mark seems to be written by somebody who wasn't a native Greek speaker. It's written in Greek, but the grammar is a little off and the words are simple. The Gospel of Luke is written by somebody who had a great vocabulary and excellent grammar. And so if God's just dictating to the biblical authors, then God used different grammar and different vocabularies and different writing styles. And so when we read anything in the Bible, we're reading something that was produced in its time by particular people with a particular view of the world. And then interpretation is the act or the art of figuring out, what does this mean for my spiritual life? What does it mean now? How was God speaking through the authors or to the authors in a way maybe they didn't even fully understand? What was the dynamic? Was God maybe communicating something that was actually progressive for its time? And what could that mean for us now? So over the course of several years, I came to see that interpreting the Bible involves a lot more gray than black and white. So let's dive into the issue of sexuality in the Bible. So when I was in seminary, my Old Testament professor was a man named Dan Hawk, Dr. Dan Hawk. And he was actually one of our guests online during the COVID lockdown when we were online only. And I've just grown to love Dr. Hawk. And in the Old Testament class one day, there were some students who came into seminary kind of thinking they already know the answers to every question, which made me think, they're paying a lot of tuition money if they already know everything. But you've probably experienced that. There are always a couple students in class who just kind of think they know everything and they want to test the professor. And we were in Leviticus in the Old Testament one day in class, and one of the students raised his hand and he wanted to just make a point about the gay agenda, quote unquote, and maybe see what all of us think about sexuality. And he just made the statement, Leviticus is pretty clear that same-sex relationships are forbidden, and it was just one of those ways of testing the professor and testing the other students. And I remember Dr. Hawk, who I'm sure realized what was happening, saying, the Bible doesn't really say that much about sexuality and marriage in general. It really doesn't. For folks who focus on this issue, there are 6 or 7 verses in the Bible that are referred to as the clobber passages. And they're interpreted as just being black and white and flatly prohibiting any kind of same-sex relationships. And he said, but the Bible really doesn't say a whole lot about sexuality and marriage compared to other topics the Bible addresses, like poverty and injustice and doing what's right by everybody in the world, giving everybody a fair chance. And so Dr. Hawk went to some verses in Leviticus, and he started with the verses in Leviticus chapter 18 and chapter 20 that seem to speak to same-sex relationships very plainly. They won't be on the screen here, but I'll go ahead and read them. Many of you probably have heard these, and to be honest, they're hard for me to read because they're just so difficult to hear. If you have people in your life who are LGBTQ folks and you love folks, or if you are yourself, and so these are hard for me to read, but what I want to do is honestly deal with the Bible. And so Leviticus chapter 18:22 says, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, that is detestable." The more well-known word is an abomination. And that word probably triggers all kinds of pain in your heart. And then Leviticus 20 says, "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them has done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." So Dr. Hawk said, I think it would be helpful if we read some other verses in Leviticus. And so what he did was he had the class open up their Bibles and flip to Leviticus. And he said, let's turn to Leviticus chapter 11, verses 9 and 10. And then he read this. "Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean." Well, that leaves out shellfish. So this is the do not eat shellfish passage. Oysters, clams, scallops, lobster. Did you have any shrimp cocktail on New Year's Eve? Well, if you're following Leviticus, no more shrimp cocktail. because Leviticus prohibits the eating of shellfish. And then he said, let's flip to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9. He read, anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Because they have cursed their father or mother, their blood will be on their own head. Now, I don't think it's good to curse your mother and father, but anybody ever kind of yelled at your mother and father and told them off? Well, you're lucky to be alive, because, and like Deuteronomy says that a person who is rebellious against their parents, they should be stoned to death. My guess is many of us wouldn't be alive right now if we wanted to read Leviticus literally and everything that it says on social issues. And he said, let's turn to Leviticus chapter 19, verses 27 and 28. And he read, do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Have you cut the corner of your beard recently? Any tattoos? Do you cut your body for the dead? If you do, please don't do that if you want to interpret Leviticus literally. So you probably know what a Hasidic Jew is. They're people who have kind of long parts of their hair and their beards. The men they'll not trim the corners of their beard, and they'll wear a black hat and black coats, and some will wear a box on their heads with what the Bible tells them to wear. And so if you were to literally apply Leviticus, you would look like a Hasidic Jew. And so when we read, don't trim the corners of your beard, men, does that reflect God's eternal will for humanity? Or is it a cultural view of the time, like cutting your body for the dead? I've never been tempted to cut my body for the dead, but apparently there were cultures around the children of Israel who practiced these kinds of things. And the children of Israel wanted to stand out and be separate from them. So they didn't want to look like who they considered to be the pagans. And then he said, let's turn to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19. And he read this. God says, keep my decrees. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. Is anybody wearing a cotton polyester blend today? You see, if we take Leviticus literally and everything it says, we're all in trouble. Most of us wouldn't be here. We would have been executed a long time ago. And Dr. Hawk said this in class. He said, Leviticus is simply not very helpful if you want to understand human sexuality. Then you've got the thing with shellfish and the cotton polyester blend. We have to consider the historical context of whatever passage we read. So I thought in honor of the Super Bowl halftime show this past week with Dr. Dre, I would show this meme. I love this. Straight out of context. I promise you, at some point there will be a sermon series at the Well called Straight Out of Context. And so that's the Old Testament. And so what about the New Testament? There are Christians who would say, well, that's the Old Testament. We don't follow Old Testament laws. So what about the New Testament? And so there are verses in the New Testament that are those clobber passages that are traditionally viewed as flatly prohibiting people who have a sexual orientation towards same-sex relationships from being in a relationship with another person. And so, once again, I'm going to read parts of these passages. I can give you the warning that for some these are difficult to read. I'm going to avoid the parts that may be the hardest, but we're going to talk about the context, and you could read them on your own if you want, because they just don't fit the culture of 21st century America. But I want to seriously consider these passages for people who say, well, the Well doesn't believe the Bible. And how could we accept people who are in the LGBT community and still love the Bible? So the first is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. And Paul writes to the Corinthian Christians, or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. Now notice some of the people in this category: thieves, people who take advantage of other people, swindlers. There are all kinds of ways of stealing money from folks. We see that in our culture. We see, of course, petty theft, and we see white-collar crime. We see wage theft in our culture, but a lot of times when people read passages like this, they just skip over those things, and they go straight to anything they see as a sexual issue. So in verse 9, Paul actually makes up new words that are not found in literature of the time. He writes, soft ones, literally the interpretation is soft ones, and those who have man sex. Paul makes up terms, and he mentions idolatry in verse 9, and it's thought that this specifically speaks to the practice of Greek temple prostitution. Now, you're thinking, what? If you've never heard this before, but this is the importance of historical context. When we assume that the culture that the biblical books were written in is just like our culture, we can miss some very important parts of their culture that would help us to interpret what we're reading. So in Greek cities, Greco-Roman cities of the Roman Empire, there were temples. And part of the Greco-Roman religion was having sexual interaction with temple prostitutes who lived in that temple. And one of those types of temple prostitution relationships was an older man with a younger man, perhaps whom we would call now a boy. And this practice is called pederasty. And so a man who wanted to go to the temple would have sex with a younger man or a boy who lived at that temple and was likely a slave for the purpose of having a sexual relationship with the men who came to that temple. Now, we would call that, first of all, slavery if they were being held against their will. And if they are who we would consider minors, we would call that pedophilia. And it's in the context of what Paul would consider idolatry, worshiping gods other than the God of Christians and Jews. And so Paul thinks of same-sex relationships likely out of his understanding of Greco-Roman culture and what goes on in these Greco-Roman temples. And my guess is, if we're talking about an adult man having sex with a young boy who is a slave, you would consider that repulsive as well, as Paul did. And so the Bible doesn't contain terms like orientation or homosexuality. There is really no reason to believe that Paul is writing about two consenting adults of equal power having a committed, loving relationship with each other even in a marriage, and they're members of the same sex. That's a 21st century understanding of same-sex relationships. There is really no evidence to suggest that that's what Paul is thinking. He's much more likely to have been thinking about what he saw in his culture. When Paul thinks of same-sex relationships, he's thinking of these things. It's in his mind, it's likely all wrapped up into what he sees in Greco-Roman culture. Now, for some of you, that just might be the first time you've ever heard anything like that. This has been a part of Bible scholarship for decades. For decades. The study of it's called Greco-Roman culture because it's the time of the Roman Empire and the Romans loved Greek culture. And it's part of the religion of the time. We have known this from archaeology, from history, for a very long time. But if Christians in America go to churches where same-sex marriage is a part of a political agenda, those pastors don't talk about what's been happening in Bible scholarship for decades and decades. They just want to read their own prejudices into the Bible and then use those to get people to vote a certain way. That's been happening at least for my entire life. But this has been a part of Bible scholarship for decades and decades. Another example is Romans chapter 1. Paul's letter to the Romans is written to Christians in the city of Rome who were worshiping probably mostly in house churches. And there were Jewish Christians at the time and Gentile Christians who were trying to worship in the same communities, and they were having a hard time getting along with each other. And Paul writes the letter to the Romans trying to unite these Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And in chapter 1, verses 18 through 23, Paul starts this way: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness by those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made, so they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and in their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles." And then in verse 24, Paul writes, "Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity," and goes on talking about the passages that, he goes on writing the passages that are often quoted to condemn people in same-sex relationships. Clearly, Paul is writing here about what he considers to be idolatry, the religion of the Greco-Roman world, that they know God through creation, but instead of worshiping God, they create idols, things that are images of God, little idols they could carry around. Clearly, Paul is talking about what he considers to be idolatry. And then he said, a feature of idolatry is that you'll see men and women having relationships with members of the same sex. Once again, we know that that was a part of Greco-Roman temple prostitution, which Paul considers idolatry. It's clear to one who knows historical context that certainly Paul is thinking about his own cultural context as he's addressing what he views as these same-sex relationships and why they're taking place. And so if you said to Paul, what causes same-sex relationships? Why would somebody have a relationship with a member of the same sex? Paul would answer, idolatry. Is that a 21st century American understanding of why a person would be in a same-sex relationship, or why a person would be transgendered? I don't think it does. Paul was writing as a person of his time, living in his culture, and criticizing a practice that he saw, and if it reflects slavery and sex with a minor, any of us would consider that repulsive. But in his mind, it's all one issue. Once again, the Bible doesn't use phrases like orientation. There is no description of two consenting adults in an equal power structure having a relationship with one another because they love each other and they want to commit to one another. That's just simply not the context of these passages. And so I also have to ask, if Paul were alive right now, would he say something different about slavery? I think he would. Would he say something different about women and women wearing head coverings to show that they are beneath their husbands in the chain of authority, which 1 Corinthians 11 seems to say? I think Paul would write something different about that now. He wouldn't be writing to the Romans or the Colossians necessarily. Paul might be writing letters like the New Yorkers or the Londoners, or writing to people in cities in South America or Africa and addressing issues that they are facing now in their culture or in our culture. I think Paul would say something different about slavery if he were writing right now. And I think he would say something different about sexuality as well. And so for me, over the years, I began to see that interpreting the Bible is not as black and white as I was led to believe, often by people who had a political agenda. They wanted to scapegoat LGBTQ folks and get Christians to vote for their candidates and use LGBTQ people as a political football. But interpreting the Bible, anything in the Bible, involves a lot more gray than it does black and white. And then the second reason that I came to see this issue so much differently over time was that I got to meet and know and love people who are a part of the LGBTQ community. And I'll share 3 examples. So when I was in high school, I had some friends that I had lunch with every day. And you know, what lunch table you sit at says a lot about who you are in high school. Like, that's really important. And some of my friends at the same lunch table were Mike and Sarah. And at that time, we were in our late teens, late in high school, and Mike and Sarah, I think, were getting to know themselves. And maybe somewhere along the process of coming out. And they were friends of mine. I knew them and loved them and had canned lemonade that I bought at the cafeteria, along with like the flat rectangular pizza that was like cardboard with, you know, a little bit of cheese and the cheapest pepperoni thrown on top. And they were my friends. And we talked about life. And then at the same time, Christian TV was on in my house every day. Some folks in my family watched Pat Robertson on TV, the televangelist Pat Robertson. And Pat Robertson described people in same-sex relationships as people who were all about the gay agenda. And as he talked about them, he seemed to insinuate that they were a part of some kind of plan to create this new world order that was evil. There were even times that the word satanic was used, and the gay agenda was a part of uniting us into a one world government, and there was going to be an antichrist, and Jesus would come back, and there would be a war of Armageddon, and somehow people who were gay are a part of that. And then when he would talk about that, the TV would flash to images of the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade, and maybe some people would be painted blue and carrying banners, and that was meant to portray that these people are wild. And now, of course, it turned out that those people just looked like they were a lot more fun than Pat Robertson, but that was an unintended consequence of his point. And so I saw this on Christian TV every day, but then I had my friends at school. The first time I ever played guitar, actually, was with Sarah. And she taught me part of a Smashing Pumpkins song. So that's my era. The song's called Cherub Rock. Yeah, it's a great song. I play it now. The first time I ever played guitar was with her. And so I had this cognitive dissonance that I'm seeing something given to me by a televangelist every day and telling me that I need to vote for a certain candidate. And then I have my experience of my friends. And we're sitting at lunch talking about grunge music and life and how bad this pizza tastes. And so that was the beginning for me. And then a few years later, I was a pastor, and I went to a conference, and it wasn't necessarily a Christian conference. It was a conference about mental and emotional health. And we had table breakout sessions and table discussions like you do at most conferences. Like, you'll have a keynote speaker, and then you'll break into table discussions. And there was a young guy at my table about the same age as me named Michael. And you know, you go around the table, you have your name tag, and you go around the table and introduce yourself. And I said, my name's Ryan, I'm a pastor here locally. And after one of the discussions, Michael leaned over. I think he was sitting a couple of seats away from me. And he said, I just wanted to tell you, when you introduced yourself and you said you were a pastor, I kind of became guarded. And I see now that we've interacted more, you seem to be a nice guy. And I just wanted to say that, I became guarded because he told me that he's gay. And he said, when I heard you were a pastor, I was just kind of defensive because I grew up in church and I know what happened to me. And I said, I'm sorry. And I said, do you mind sharing what happened? And what he shared with me has always stuck with me. And it actually became one of the most influential steps in my journey, I think, of seeing this issue differently. And Michael shared with me that when he was 11 or 12, he was in 5th or 6th grade. He said he was sitting in class one day and he was just kind of looking around the class, distracted during math or something. And he saw another boy in the class and he felt attracted to that other boy in the class. And he said he felt that and he just snapped his head back to the teacher who was writing on the chalkboard back when that was a thing. And he said he was terrified. And he went home that night and he prayed like he did every night before he went to bed. He said prayers. He said he prayed, God, please don't let me be gay. He was a part of a church in a mainline denomination. They went every Sunday, and he said he prayed that because he knew how his family and how his congregation would respond to him if he were to admit that he felt an attraction to the same sex. And as he told me this story, I could see tears welling up in his eyes. And as a pastor, when I heard him say that he prayed as a boy, God, please don't let me be gay, I heard the story of a young man who went to church every Sunday and prayed to God and was terrified because of something that he had no control over. He didn't choose it. It just happened. And he knew how he would be treated. And I walked away from that interaction with him thinking, I need to do some serious research about this topic, because I can't be a part of a structure that would cause a young child to be terrified and pray that God would make them different than they are. I'm thankful to Michael that he had the courage to share his story with me. And it became an influential step in my journey. And then the last story I want to share came from about 9 years ago. My wife and I started a church called One Church here in the Valley, and we moved here in March of 2012 to start the church. And it took us a year to do all the groundwork, form a launch team, and get everything ready to launch our weekly services in March of 2013. And we ran social media ads and ads in the local newspapers. And the night before we launched our first weekly service, I received an email from a woman in Chandler. And I want to read this email to you. And she became, well, I won't divulge the rest of the story yet, but I'll just read the email that she sent to me the night before we launched weekly services. She wrote, "Hi Ryan, I just came across an ad for the well in the Santan Sun News, one of the local papers here, and I would like to be straightforward, pun intended," she wrote, "and know what the well's view/belief on sexuality is. I've been searching for a church for my family for the past 3 years. We have tried out a few, but the good old standby of love the sinner, not the sin, always surfaces. I believe my family with 2 moms and 3 adopted children isn't broken, and we don't need fixing. I'm in need of a safe place to teach my children about Jesus, where they won't be told that their family is wrong or bad. I know that you cannot speak for the members of the church, and I'm not asking for all people to be accepting, but overall, I would appreciate an honest answer on how the church handles this topic. Thanks so much for your time. Looking forward to your response. Respectfully." And then she put her name. Now that was an email to me, but it really was an email to our church as well. And in my opinion, this is an email to every church now, because there are so many people who have the same experience she did. She sees the sign on the corner, the sandwich board sign that says, "Come to this church," with an arrow pointing, and it says all are welcome, and then they get there and then they find out a year or 3 years later that they didn't really mean that. There are so many people who have that experience, And in my view, this is an email to every church and every pastor in America. How would you respond to her email? Well, my response was that you are absolutely welcome, and we're going to make sure this is a safe place for your family. And I hadn't made it clear yet to everybody in the congregation that we were going to be a completely welcoming and affirming church. I made it clear within a few months. And when I did, there were people who left the church, but there were more people who came. And since that time, it has been one of the greatest joys of my life to welcome the LGBTQ community into full participation in the churches I pastor. I have met some of the most wonderful, beautiful people I've ever met in my life. It has been an absolute honor and privilege and joy for me to be an affirming and welcoming pastor. And I would not trade my relationships with those people for all the nasty Facebook comments in the world. It's been worth every one because of the amazing people that I have gotten to know and love and serve as their pastor. So in any difficult question, there are well-meaning Christians who believe that, well, if we look at these verses and they just seem to be so black and white, and then we accept people in spite of what it seems like these verses say, then somehow the Bible is losing. That culture, our culture is winning. We're losing the culture war. The Bible is losing, and we're losing the culture war to these people who have an agenda. And I would like to submit that, as I've learned that interpreting the Bible requires a lot more gray than black and white, that's not true at all, actually. This historian named Mark Knoll, who is a Christian and also a student of American history and an expert on American history. And of course, he writes that the Bible was very important in American society in the 1800s, and that's why pastors appealed to the Bible to both defend and criticize slavery. And there are verses in the Bible that assume that slavery will always exist, and those were quoted by largely Southern pastors to support slavery. He said, but eventually there was a particular Bible passage that won out over all of the verses that assume the existence of slavery. That it wasn't like the Bible lost and culture won when it came to the slavery issue. No, he said some verses in the Bible just became interpreted in the light of their historical context in the Grecoroman society that assumed the existence of slavery. But there was one passage in the Bible that became primary, and this passage is what won. And he said it's this. It's the teaching of Jesus when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Like, if I follow this commandment, it's the most important thing God wants from me. And Jesus answered like this in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40. Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it or linked to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Jesus said, if you love God and love your neighbor, you're doing everything that God requires from you. And historian Mark Knoll says, when a majority of the American people realized that slave is my neighbor, that was the end of legal slavery in the United States. It wasn't that progressive culture and Abraham Lincoln won and the Bible lost. That's not what happened. No, there were some verses in the Bible that they just became to be interpreted in the light of their historical context, that slavery was assumed in the Roman Empire. But no, this verse actually won. This part of the Bible won. And this part of the Bible always wins. Because in the greatest commandment, Jesus said that love wins. For Christians, Jesus wins. It's not Ephesians 6:5 that wins. It's the teaching of Jesus. It's the greatest commandment. What Jesus said was the most important thing. Jesus wins because Jesus said, love wins. So it's not that we're in a culture war, and if we change our mind on these passages, the culture wins and the Bible loses. That's not how this works. Jesus wins because Jesus taught that love wins. And we don't stone disobedient children because it's just a lot easier to take away their video games for the day. Actually, we don't stone them because we love them, because they're our neighbors. And we don't keep slaves because we love our neighbors. And we don't subjugate women because we love our neighbors. And we don't relegate LGBTQ folks to second-class citizenship or punish them or, my goodness, do what Leviticus says. We don't do that because we love them. They're our neighbors. We don't beat our children with rods because they're neighbors. Many of us still eat shellfish. Maybe we don't consider them a neighbor. But we allow the teaching of Jesus, what Jesus said is the main thing, to be the main thing. So when I'm in doubt as to how to interpret complex Bible passages in light of cultural differences between the biblical authors in 21st century America, I choose to believe that Jesus wins. Because Jesus said that love wins. I invite you to pray with me. God, thank you most of all for the passage we just read, the teaching of Jesus. And what we find here is the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that comes from Matthew chapter 7. And we find that in other faiths. We find Rabbi Hillel saying a form of that. We find a form of that in some other world religions. But in this particular form, Jesus said it, and Jesus didn't actually make this up. Jesus was getting this from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Jesus was actually following his own faith from these books that we quoted earlier. It's just that this was his interpretation of them. That no, we don't stone people, but we love our neighbors like Leviticus and Deuteronomy tells us to do. So God, we thank you for all of those who want to take the Bible seriously and they want to follow you, and they're well-meaning people. And they have questions, and maybe they've never even heard some of this material before that's been a part of Bible scholarship for decades. But God, for all of us who are thinking people and compassionate people and we want to take the Bible seriously, God, we realize that we need to interpret the Bible in the light of its historical context. Keeping the main thing. What Jesus said was the main thing. And that's loving God and loving our neighbors. And that's the lens that we interpret all other passages through, just like Jesus did. He said all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And God, I want to personally thank you for all the folks in my life who come from the LGBTQ community here at the Well and that I've known in the past and all over the world who want to follow Jesus. They want a relationship with you and they want to be a part of a community where they can just be safe and belong and be loved. God, thank you for this community called the Well, and we pray for so many more communities. We should start more communities, God. Certainly you're calling us to start new churches like the Well, start other locations of the Well where churches like this are needed. God, it's so important because Jesus said that the main thing is to love you and love our neighbors as ourselves. And we get the calling and the privilege of joining you in doing that. And we thank you. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen.